Hi, everybody. My name is Corey Gill-Schuster. I am the director of the MA program in conflict resolution and mediation. We have brought with us one of our great lecturers, Dr. Joel Parker. Before I introduce him, I would like to say a few quick things. First of all, if anyone is interested in the program, the MA program in conflict resolution and mediation, please reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat, and you can always reach out to me personally, and I can give you a great overview of the program itself. Dr. Joel Parker is a researcher and internship and visiting scholar manager at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. He also teaches our History of the Middle East course in the program. Joel, please.
Thanks for having me. Just before I open up the PowerPoint, I want to say thank you for those who are here and looking forward to talking about Syria with you. You're going to be muted for the talk, but if I say something really funny, feel free to unmute yourself and laugh. I mean, that's always good. No, just kidding. You can if you want, but without further ado, I'll go ahead and open my PowerPoint here and we'll get started. I know some people are probably going to be pouring in here over the next few minutes, so I'll start slowly and then try and move quickly as we go along. So here's this. I think I may have to share this again. That's how it always works. Do double share. Oh, whoops. Let me share this with this sound and video. There's one short little video clip I wanted to share. Okay. Sorry, 1 second. What I want to talk about today is the kind of internal situation in Syria and I'm going to go over some maps to help with those who aren't so familiar with the political makeup of Syria, including the ethnic and religious groups. And what's going on today? First of all, we have a whole new situation, so I'm going to try and walk you through it without necessarily walking, because we don't have that much time to explain all of Syrian history and how we got to the present day. However, I'm going to try to give you at least a little bit of context to what's going on today. And I'm going to not try and talk down to you, but I am going to try and bring you to talk as if you don't really know that much about Syrian history. So forgive me if you are already an expert. Hopefully experts will learn something as well. Now, why did I entitle it Between Justice and Revenge? Now, first of all, I have to explain that, and I will talk about that. What the issue is that Syria has been under a dictatorship for the past 40 years plus. In fact, maybe the last 50 years, it's been under some form of military regime. And that has all ended in the past month. So Syria is in a situation where they have now a whole bunch of people who are upset. And they know that one of their loved ones was mistreated and or killed by the former regime. So you have a situation where you have families that were supporting the regime, some of them out of fear, some of them out of genuine appreciation for the regime, who are, so to speak, now targeted as people who formerly supported this terrible dictatorship. And you have the larger group of people who are angry with that group of people. So you have to figure out how to move forward to build a new political system while somehow including the former regime supporters and satisfying the people who are angry with the former regime supporters. That's why I write Between Justice and Revenge. Somehow they have to find a way to perhaps bring the worst perpetrators to justice without turning into a free-for-all massacre of anybody and everybody who ever had a poster of Bashar al-Assad in their house, which would be almost anybody and everybody. So let's move on and try and figure out how do I move forward with the PowerPoint? Okay, so first of all, I want to go back in time. And I'm watching the clock here. I don't want to bore you with too much past detail because we want to get to the present. But there has always been an issue with the territory of Syria, which is that the fact that there were several minorities and a majority. The Sunni Arab population is the majority, Sunni being the religious group of Muslims tied more to the Saudi Arabian style of Islam, and Arab, meaning the ethnicity of Arabs, people who speak Arabic and consider themselves to be Arab. I don't want to go into that too much, or the Sunni issue too much. Just so you know, that's the majority. Over somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population in Syria has traditionally identified as Sunni Arab, meaning a clear majority. And of the minorities, there were several different groups we'll talk about in a few minutes. But going back to the 1800s, I don't want to go back before that, but in the 1800s, we had the first kind of moments of what we call sectarian violence, where different groups clashed, and often it was from the ground up, riots, or in some cases, the influx of anti-Semitism, as we saw in 1839 with the famous Damascus blood libel, which is a whole story I don't want to go into, but it was a case where several rabbis were captured and tortured to confess for a crime of murdering a Christian to use his blood, which was never didn't actually happen, and that led to several changes. In fact, positive changes for the minority, the Jewish minority, and later on, the Christian minority also wanted to have more rights, and that turned into a bit of a problem with anti-Christian riots happening in 1860, about 20 years later. And so over the years, you had various moments, but if I highlight these moments alone, you would think that, oh, Syrians were constantly killing each other or doing horrible things to each other. And as far as I know, that's not the case. In fact, Syrians were mostly living side by side in relative harmony, given a few crimes here and there. Now, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, you had a major sharp rise in ethno-national sentiment, which led to attacks on large groups of Christians, in particular the Armenians, the Assyrians, and the Greek Christian minorities, in a series of massacres, in some cases orchestrated as what we call today a genocide. And that led to mostly the decimation of the Christian populations in what we call today Turkey. Now, the French and the British divided up the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, to make a long story short. And the French mandate came in to keep the minority, and promising to keep the minorities safe from this, given this past history of potential violence. The French came in after the fall of the Ottoman Empire to, so to speak, keep the communities safe from each other. With this potential myth being built that if the French or if some other strong hand wasn't there, people would all suddenly just start killing each other. And the first Syrian leaders, when Syria became independent in the 1940s, were mostly Sunnis, not necessarily Arab ethnicity. Some of them were Kurdish. But in any case, when Syria first became independent, actually sectarian violence was rare, aside from, and I should add, some anti-Jewish violence that happened in the late 40s, sparked mostly by political tension with Zionism. But that's a whole different story we don't have time for. Here's the map of how the French decided to divide up Syria. Syria was divided up in terms of what we call compact minorities. You can see the purple state, the Alawite state was created, and of course, Greater Lebanon. And what we now know as Syria, the main bulk of Syria was divided between the Aleppo state and the Damascus state, with another small compact minority being formed in the south, the Druze state. And that, by the way, did not last very long, because the Syrians themselves had an uprising and fought the French to unify the Syrian state. And the French essentially got rid of the borders between the north and south, between Aleppo and Damascus. And over time, also the Alawites and the Druze were incorporated into a central Syrian state, which became the basis for today's modern state of Syria. Now, to go forward quickly, and I know I don't want to bore you with history, but I think it is important to understand the Syrian Ba'ath Party. Now, you might have heard of the Ba'ath Party if you've heard of Saddam Hussein, and of course, if you know anything about Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad. They inherited the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, which happened in the 1950s. And one of the things that they did was they wanted to open up the army to have officers from all the minority sects in order to unite the nation. It was a policy that was designed to bring everybody together. Most armies do that around the world, try and get minorities involved, because the army is sometimes seen as the social melting pot for the country. And in fact, that was the idea in the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, was that everybody should be involved. And what it ended up inadvertently leading to was a military coup led by a small group of officers who were mainly from the Alawi sect. As I showed you back a couple of slides ago, that purple area, mostly from that region of Latakia. Today, of course, Alawis are spread around, and even then they were spread around. They were concentrated mainly on the coastal area. The party advocated kind of state-led economic growth, as you can see from the name socialism, and the Sunni Arab majority slowly became kind of dominated by the Alawi minority sect, although I will add a caveat to that in a minute. It wasn't that simple. The ruling power, basically from 1970 onward, being under Hafez al-Assad, he actually got in a bunch of Sunni Arabs as well as the other minorities to form a close-knit inner circle of ruling elites. And you would call them the new elites who took over the country from the old traditional landowning class of mostly Sunni Arabs who were part of the old Ottoman elite system. They were essentially completely overthrown by a new upstart group of people. This movement and the party consolidated power under Hafez al-Assad, who managed to kill all of his enemies or imprison them from 1970 until 2024. So that is an extremely long period of time, and I'm very much oversimplifying things. So because we have more to get to. This is a very simple map, very complicated map, but a very simple idea. It's just showing the different religious groups inside what's today Syria. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but there's different groups: the Alawite, the Alavi, the Druze, the Shia, the Ismaili. We have Sunnis, and we have from two different rights here. They actually divided up. Most of the Sunnis get along with each other, although it is, if you want to get into the details, there are different legal systems between the Sunni Arab communities or Sunni communities. Then we have within the Christian groups, there are also a lot of differences. There's the Armenians, who some of them actually are ancestors of those who fled from Anatolia, the Greek Orthodox, the Melkite, and the Syriac Orthodox. Some of whom the Syriac Orthodox, interestingly, still in a few villages where they are located near in the sort of south. You can't see my hands. I'm trying to point. They actually still speak a form of Aramaic that goes back to the time of the Bible and Jesus and all of that, which is quite fascinating. And Judaism here is mentioned just because of the Golan Heights, which of course is under Israeli control and has now been accepted by the U.S. as Israeli territory and doesn't look to be ceded anytime soon. We'll see about that. Under Hafez al-Assad, the way he ruled was by patronage. He managed to give people, he used the carrot and the stick. He gave minorities strong, positive encouragement to rise up in the system, but he also found that there were many Sunnis who were from what we call working classes, or if you even want to use the term proletariat or whatever, Marxist framework, you can say that a lot of the Sunnis who were more disenfranchised by the old landowning class, such as the peasantry, were open to the idea of a new ruler who's going to bring everybody into his state-led economy, and they benefited from it. They joined the army or they joined other forces, such as when my last point here, this huge security network of the Mukhabarat. In any case, it's a long story, but you can get the idea that the lower classes were more involved in the development of this new elite state, and the new disenfranchised group was actually the more kind of middle and upper class Sunni Arab population, who some of them fled, some of them just remained, and some of them were imprisoned over the years for daring to speak out against this new regime. Now, Syria also changed its international orientation, which we're going to talk about a bit more as we move forward. Initially, they were gravitating under the military socialist style Ba'ath Party. They kind of gravitated towards the Soviet Union, but they were never a full Soviet satellite state, so to speak. Nothing like Czechoslovakia or Poland. They got weapons, and technical experts, economic experts came to help develop Syria in exchange for sending, crops and things like that to Russia. And over time, Syria and Iraq both had came to be ruled by a similar party, the Ba'ath Party, but they became enemies, so to speak, in a political sense. Not They weren't enemies, total enemies, but after the 1979 revolution in Iraq, in Iran, Syria and Iran became allies against Iraq, which is a kind of crazy thing because both sides had preached Arab nationalism, that Arabs should always be brothers in the face of, other ethnicities like the Turkish or the Iranians. And in the Iran-Iraq war, we see that real politics, the actual alliance and benefits and interests outweighed these kinds of identity politics. So anyway, you can see that the Iranians, this is kind of a contemporary map of how Iran has set up proxy organizations around Syria. This is a few examples of different groups that they've set up, but you can see Iran in green versus, I would say, the Saudi. Well, this map shows kind of like the anti-Iran axis versus the pro-Iran axis with some neutral powers. It's a kind of complicated map. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but Syria was divided during the Civil War between the sort of north and south, and I'll show you a couple of maps of that. Let's talk just for briefly how this all happened. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad took office from his father, who died, and passed along the presidency to him. And Bashar al-Assad, he was an optometrist, educated in Britain for some of his education. And some outside observers thought that perhaps he was going to open Syria up to the Western liberal capitalist model. Anyway, the Soviet Union was long in the past, and perhaps, just generally liberalizing, opening up the country was going to be possible. But he realized that as a minority-based leader and under the system that they had created, there was just no way to liberalize without destroying everything. It was one of those things where as soon as you take the lid off, you're going to open up a whole can of worms, literally. And so he refused to do that, actually. After maybe toying with the idea briefly, he decided to keep it under control. And when the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, countries like Tunisia, Yemen, and Egypt all kind of joined in the call for freedom against dictatorship. And the Syrians slowly, especially from the intellectual class, the elites, as well as some of the kind of Sunni Arabs who felt disenfranchised, and some of the lower class people who had actually felt that the regime had not really given them economic benefits to the extent that they really would have wanted, all started joining in this call for freedom from dictatorship. And the regime had to, first of all, it responded with violence. But second of all, it also tried to grant some of the different minorities, like the Kurds, more rights to prevent breakaway movements inside Syria. The rebellion began, and initially, Western sources were also excited that perhaps a new country that would be pro-Western, liberal, moving away from the old Soviet axis and even from the Iranian axis would be formed. And so, we know that under Barack Obama and even the CIA, people helped some of the rebellion succeed at first, but then it became kind of it got out of control. They couldn't, what happened was the rebellion itself became far more Islamic and extreme than was expected at the beginning, and you had the influx of ISIS, the ISIS coming from Iraq. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And essentially, what happened over time was the regime lost control over large parts of the country, including the oil production in the east of the country, which I'll show in a minute. And it couldn't distribute funds. It also eventually ran out of money. Bashar al-Assad became fully dependent on Russia and Iran to help support his regime. Now, this is a small map, or not a small map, it's a regular map of what you could see before 2011. This shows you some of the different groups, and we might come back to this in the question and answer time. I do see there's some chat already started. Corey, is there a question? Did I miss
No,
something?
no, you didn't miss anything.
We'll stay. Okay, so we'll go to the questions at the end. But for now, and we can also come back to these maps. But this map shows you, the yellow side shows you kind of like how the Alawi population had spread out a little bit from Latakia. And then you see this purple color for the Christian groups. Um, sorry, that's the purple is Ismaili. Christian is the light blue. And you can see the light blue groups are kind of spread all over the sort of what we call the western side of Syria, as well as a little bit also in the northeast. And so the Christians are actually quite spread out in Syria, meaning the Christian community in Syria has to really hope that the regime, whatever regime it is, respects their rights because they don't have any ability to, so to speak, defend themselves collectively. Um, uh, that's as opposed to other groups like the Kurdish group, which is here not actually, the Kurds tend to be mostly Sunni Muslim to make things more confusing, but they predominantly live in the north, but not all over the north, only in certain sections. Anyway, we'll move on from there. The Druze community is in the south, and as we know in Israel itself, we have a Druze minority in the Golan Heights and also near the Carmel Mountain area. Minority majority relations is always a tricky issue. And so, no country gets it perfect, but most countries, I think that especially liberal democracies, want to try and balance the interest of having a united patriotism in the state versus, treating minorities with care and respect, so that they don't feel like they're being shouted down by the majority. Now, here's a question that kind of leads us to the present day. It's an interesting question that we don't have time to really go into, but I think it is important to ask the question, why did the Islamist rebels succeed? And now this is something we want to talk about. How several factors contributed to the Islamization of the rebellion. Can't go into it carefully and slowly, but what I would say is that the uprising against Bashar al-Assad changed dramatically. I would say almost became a diametric opposite of how it started, because initially it was very inclusive, very liberal, very open, very much talking about a new Syrian patriotic alliance of all factions, including Alawis. Every minority was welcome. It was essentially, we might even call it secular. It was not framed in any particular religious wording. It was anti-regime, though. And so the regime brutally suppressed it and used violence, starting from almost day one in 2011, when these protests began forming. Now, okay, so how did it become Islamicized? Well, one of the things is that the sort of it sounds kind of weird, but the nice liberal middle class group, they mostly fled. They just kind of like said, hey, if the choice is getting killed or joining a massive armed rebellion, I think I'd rather choose option number 3, which is getting the heck out of here. So one thing is that a lot of the poorer, more hardcore people who were ready to fight to the death were the ones who stayed and said, I'm gonna see this to the end. Now, there were also foreigners who came in to join the jihadis once it became more Islamic in nature. They also hardened their idea that the regime itself is sectarian. That means the regime itself is biased against Sunni Arabs, which wasn't 100% accurate, but anyway, that became the narrative that became the strongest unifying narrative among the rebels, that the regime itself is sectarian and hates us, meaning the Sunni Arabs. And that, of course, became more reinforced when the Iranians sent in their proxy fighters, who often were Shia Muslims or from different minority groups who didn't particularly like the Sunni Arabs. So the other thing is that initially some of the uprising wasn't by people who necessarily said the whole system has to be revised. Some of them said the system can be reformed. And that, as the revolts became increasingly violent, and violence was met with violence, the idea was that this regime cannot be reformed. It can only be overthrown in a revolutionary, some kind of revolution. Okay, so here's where the front lines were as of late November 2024. The north shows the north actually this white area shows Idlib, which is where HTS, we'll talk about that in a second. The main group that succeeded or that spearheaded the drive to overthrow Assad from late November to December 8th. This group was based in the white area, Idlib, and the green areas represent more of the Syrian rebellion who were allied with Turkey. They even have, in some cases, Turkish officers fighting with them, and they're very close to Turkish policy. Whereas the yellow area represents the SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces, ostensibly allied with the United States and led by Kurdish officers in most cases, although not always. They also have Arab tribal elements involved, and they cover the northeast, which includes basically all of the oil producing areas of Syria. Now, the regime in this sort of reddish pink area held most of the population of Syria, because the largest cities in Syria were Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus. And so the vast majority of Syrians still lived under regime control. But one of the things that enabled the success of the recent drive to overthrow the regime was the fact that regime-held areas had become increasingly impoverished. And so when the rebels arrived, in some cases, the people were not so keen to fight back. They said, "Listen, if you got something better to offer, and you're not going to kill us, we'd rather be with you than with this regime." A lot of people, it turns out, a lot more people were angry with the regime than we knew from media accounts. This is a live map of today. You see the green area being the whole area where the Syrian rebellion has succeeded, and the yellow area being represented still represents the SDF, the Kurdish area. I won't go into that too much. You just, if you want to check out like what's happening in Syria, I would suggest trying to just Google Syria live map. And each one of these little symbols, you click on it, it gives you a source and information about what's going on, who's bombing who's saying what. It's a really amazing resource. So I mentioned earlier that Syria was allied with Iran, and so who are and of course also Russia. And so who are the new allies of the rebellion? The rebellion during the Civil War, there was several regional states became increasingly involved. Now, this is something interesting because as the revolution became increasingly Islamist in character and tone and external, look, the way people wore beards and were suddenly talking a lot about Islam. A lot of the Western support tended to fade away. I mean, it was sometimes there in covert ways, but it was very difficult to sell to local publics in, say, France or Britain or Germany or America, that we're going to support these guys. Some of them might be allied with terrorists, etc. But the local regional map still believed that it was worth investing in groups that were going to change this regional dynamic. So Qatar kept supporting the rebels who were Islamist, and they didn't almost care how Islamist they were. It was they were able to get more money. In fact, the more the better. The more Islamist, the better for Qatar. Turkey also supported the Free Syrian Army and other rebels who would become anti-Kurdish, and they were okay with people who were pretty far towards the Islamist direction. Saudi Arabia actually decided to form its own militia to have full control over how Islamist they were. They called it Jaish al-Islam, and they fought even against, all the groups basically fought against ISIS because the regional powers were not interested in helping ISIS. Although some individuals helped various groups, some of them were more extreme than others, and it's a long story, very complicated. Charles Lister has a great book on that if you want to read more about the Syrian jihad and the different groups that rose up. The ISIS came into Syria and kind of really messed up a lot of the plans because they ended up fighting the rebels more than they fought the regime. But that's a different story. I don't want to go into all of that. We do need to talk about Al-Qaeda for a second because Al-Qaeda had a branch in Syria called Jabhat al-Nusra. And they became very decentralized after September 11th, after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. They lost a lot of their ability to control things. But Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who actually is currently the head of the transitional government and goes by his name now, his given name, Ahmed Hussein al-Shara. He was initially the spearhead of Jabhat al-Nusra, of the actual Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, which is something very frightening to think about. But at the same time, over the last decade, he's gradually moderated, at least from what we can see, as far as outside observers can
Where are
see,
you going?
moved away from the Al Qaeda model. In fact, he was one of the key players who helped fight against ISIS because ISIS tried to co-opt his group. And anyway, it's a little bit complicated. What happened was uh, Jolani ended up being one of the key people that was fighting both ISIS on the Eastern Front and also against Hezbollah on the Western Front. And so, as far as I know, and I don't know very much beyond public knowledge, HTS, which became the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was one of the groups that Western intelligence agencies essentially relied on for intelligence for to know what was happening with ISIS, and also they were again very useful in fighting against Hezbollah because there was a mutual interest in fighting the Iranian proxies as well as ISIS. I'm not going to say that the U.S. was allied or that the West was fully allied with HTS, but there was certainly there were back channels of communication, and I think that's public knowledge. Beyond that, I don't know. Let's just move on a bit. So the regime had its own personal militia that wasn't necessarily sectarian based, and I'll just briefly go over this. This is a fascinating story. They're called, and you'll hear this and you might have heard this if you were watching closely the news in the 2011, the Shabiha. The Shabiha means ghosts in Arabic, and it's a term that came to imply a sectarian element because since the 1970s, there was a group of people who became kind of like a cartel, and they were smuggling in drugs, weapons, and cars from Lebanon, usually from Beirut, all the way to Syria, and they would sell things inside Syria that were either stolen or somehow clandestinely shipped from Beirut or Lebanon to Syria. They became a semi-official cartel. Actually, they had government permission. And so locals began to call them Shabiha because they would drive these Mercedes-Benz cars, and that time, for whatever reason, they were always silver. And people would see these cars speeding around, and local police knew if they saw a speeding silver Mercedes-Benz, you don't touch that guy. He's part of this network of regime smugglers. And so that kind of situation died down over time. But the term was revived back in 2011 when these people were sniping out of windows, and armed groups in plain clothes would come out of trucks and start beating up protesters. And so the locals started reviving this term Shabiha, the ghosts, because they remembered back in the 70s and 80s, these kind of like thugs who were part of this cartel. And they made the connection. And in fact, in some cases, there was a direct connection of the same people were actually kind of regime loyalists. So they would be assimilated into the formal armed forces. And again, sometimes the regime kept them in plain clothes so that the regime could say, no, we're not the ones doing the violence. But in fact, they were loyalists who were involved in literally going around and beating up protesters back in 2011. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So the Alawi minority in the current situation got caught up in this war and was definitely drawn upon. And as I mentioned, the Alawites were living in the Latakia area. They're kind of an offshoot of Shia Islam. The term Ali in the name implies that. They include some kind of like pagan, if you want to use the term pagan, pre-Islamic kind of customs and an esoteric leadership, but they also kind of combine multiple layers of history in their religion. The pre-Islamic, some of it even involves Christianity and Islam, kind of all mixed together. But most people who are Alawi don't know very much about the religion unless they're specifically initiated into the sort of inner circles of what goes on there. In any case, they became a core part of the fighting force in the Syrian civil war. Some estimates say that of the 250,000 men who were fighting age, around 150,000 of them were killed in the Civil War, which is an incredible amount. That means really the whole population was almost decimated by the war. And so officers were given houses, but they weren't really given very much money because over time the Syrian currency devalued. And in any case, the Syrian officers couldn't afford to feed their families in recent months, according to some reports of people who surrendered as Jolani and his forces were coming south from Idlib. Some of the Syrian army officers took off their uniforms, threw down their guns, and raised their hands and surrendered to the new incoming forces. And when they were asked, like, why did you surrender? One of the reasons they gave was that, we were desperate. We didn't have any money. We couldn't even afford to feed our families. So some of the officers in the Syrian army were actually turning towards the drug industry and criminal activity just to sort of make ends meet, not necessarily because they were, I don't know, so to speak, bad people. In any case, I think the HTS and the Ojulani, he actually said, if you surrender, we're not going to harm you. We're not going to kill you. Which is again going back to this theme of revenge, or let's talk about the idea of revenge. The minorities were not necessarily mistreated as the jihadi forces came south from Idlib to Damascus. They consistently said over and over, we're not here to carry out massacres. We're not here to target minorities. Even the Alawi minority, which is considered to be the closest minority to the Assad regime, we're not here to, kill you guys. And in fact, that was one of the things that gave them more success, because people realized, like, okay, if you're not going to kill us, then we're not necessarily going to kill you, because we're sick and tired of this regime ourselves. In any case, there is sort of fake news coming out, like Russia and Iran are still trying to kind of incite these groups towards sectarian violence. So we'll have to see what happens. Just a quick couple of things, the word shabiha is still used in like the internet a lot, especially in Arabic. But today, I just saw going into this terms of revenge, like on the left side, you see there was a tweet here showing several videos of how many landmines have been left throughout different parts of Syria because of the civil war. Writing in Arabic, the most dangerous thing left by Assad and his thugs, using the term shabiha, is the mines, a great danger that threatens thousands of civilians. And this guy who responded, I don't know who he is, but he, responds with the 3-star flag of the Syrian revolt. Bring the thugs over to walk over the mines. Let's get rid of them on the one hand and get rid of the mines on the other. So that's kind of like the mentality I think that some Syrians do have, is like, hey, you know what? This regime has left scars on this country. We should actually be, targeting them. This is a short video that I wanted to show, a minute long, if we have the time. We're actually running a little bit short of time, but let's try and see it. It's just 1 minute long. I just want you to see the end. Keep in mind the last line. He says that the locals were actually among those who burned the tomb of Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad.
I'm here in front of the tomb of Hafiz al-Assad. People here yesterday entered the tomb of Hafiz al-Assad and burned the coffins in an act of protest. We're here in the hometown of the Assads in Qardaha, which is one of the poorest regions in Syria. Residents here tell us. The fighters who are behind us are from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but they insist that the people who burned the tomb were from the town itself of Qardaha. Apparently there's lots of resentment here. What they say is 50 years of suffering and economic neglect for the poor city.
Okay, so that's just one example. You see that resentment against the regime goes so deep that people in the hometown of Hafiz al-Assad, supposedly, according to this narrative, were, we might take it with a grain of salt, but I tend to believe it because I heard it from several different news sources. Again, it could be wrong, but they're saying that the locals were the ones who actually decided to burn the tombs, the actual grave, what do you call it, caskets of the Assad family. In any case, what we have is a problem where tens of thousands of people, a tweet here from the Syrian Network for Human Rights wrote that in an interview on Syrian TV, he said that basically there are tens of thousands of loyalists and supporters of the Assad regime who are not necessarily perpetrators of crimes against humanity and war crimes who should be allowed to apologize in writing and orally in a humble tone with an admission of guilt, perhaps in some cases pay compensation and participate in community initiatives, kind of essentially sign a document saying like, hey, we're sorry, we're going to help out now, we're going to try and expose the real criminals. This could happen, that they could actually establish kind of a tribunal that would quickly exonerate the people who were lower level members of the Assad regime, which could be one way to bring about justice. But there is one problem with that, which is this issue that in many parts of Syria, on the days after the regimes fell and the rebels came into power, there was mass arson all over Syria. Arson came about in many parts of the Assad regime, usually criminal court houses, in some cases police headquarters. But analysts who've been looking at this believe that it was arson done by former members of the regime to make sure that the new government doesn't have information on those who were involved in the regime as much as possible. Now, one quick last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll I'll kind of bring this up for the discussion, I guess. One thing that we don't really have resolved is the issue of the Kurds. Now, I'm switching gears here, but just so you know, there's negotiations going on because one of the biggest problems, the main area that's left uncaptured, so to speak, by the new government is the Kurdish area. And so there's negotiations going on. The regime has actually offered that all the YPG, which is as I mentioned before, I call it the Syrian Democratic Forces, but others call it the YPG. It's depends on who you talk to. They're one in this. They overlap. Let's just say. So the idea would be that the YPG would be integrated into the forces of the Ministry of Defense. The area of Kurdish control would share their respect for the sovereign decisions of the Damascus government, somehow be subordinate to Damascus. And 3, they would provide cultural, social, and local administration opportunities to the Kurds. And 4, so I didn't do the PowerPoint right, 80% of the oil revenues would be given to Damascus and only 20% to the autonomous administration. Now that's a kind of sticking point. The YPG rejected these conditions, and they counter-offered that we would be happy to, we want to have comprehensive local government in our region, and we don't mind being an army unit, staying as a unit and forming an independent block within the ministry. And what they said, I kind of did this wrong here, but they wanted to do it, they want between 30 and 50% of the profits, I think, from the oil and gas. And they said, no, I think they said 50-50. Number 3, they want 50% of the profits from oil and gas to the local Kurdish administration. And the Syrian administration so far has rejected these demands. So they're going back and forth on this issue. I believe and I hope that they'll reach some kind of an agreement, but the outside players like Turkey are involved, and it could go either way. We could see more armed conflict. But that's something that we're trying to watch. Now I'm coming to the conclusions here because I know it's been a bit long. I want to hear your questions. What we see is that the new government in Damascus, if it can stay in control, that means if Ahmad al-Shara doesn't get killed or something, I think that they'll try to gradually introduce broad security measures. Hopefully, people will feel safe. I didn't go into a lot of the issues with security. There's still lots of issues, including one thing I didn't mention, but in some of the minority areas, we've had very credible reports of basically former regime loyalists going into places and spreading sectarian hatred. Like, for instance, there was a a Christian bar, Christian-owned bar in one of the smaller Christian towns, and somebody came in, started saying with a beard and started saying horrible things against Christians. And the police arrested this guy, and turns out the guy was pretending to be a representative of the Damascus government. It turns out he was actually a former regime supporter, and he was faking it all, and it was not authentic at all. So you have various security issues, including people who are trying to stir up sectarian violence. The economic growth is essential. They have to get off the ground. They're in a very bad situation. More than 70% of the population is under the poverty line. And they will need to find some political inclusion. Now, I don't think it's going to be democracy tomorrow or the next day, but they will have to find some way to kind of tie in the different groups that are involved in Syria. And I think that they're going to probably have a more regional centered approach to politics. So that means they'll find themselves allying with the allies of the rebellion, which were Turkey, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And over time, I think they'll try to establish good relations with Jordan and Lebanon, but that may also take a bit more time. The biggest military issue for inside Syria right now is the Kurdish issue, because the SDF still has lots of arms, and they have U.S. backing as well. And so hopefully the U.S. will enable them to perhaps work out a negotiation that will be satisfactory to both sides. Other minorities, the Alawis, Christians, and Druze they will actually push for official recognition in the new government, and hopefully things will go smoothly. Again, I'm thinking optimistically here, but definitely things could get sour. They will need, protection in exchange for loyalty. I think that so far the signs that I'm seeing are that all three of the big religious minorities have been given assurances from, Ahmed al-Shara that they're going to be protected. And the big thing that everybody's watching is if the actions will follow these words, because so far the words that he said have been the right words. I think that's across the board agreement. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to meet with the French and German foreign ministers. And, his team is being invited now to meet with different players in the region. He's had phone calls with Lebanon. So I think that if the words weren't the right words, we would have a much different situation. What he's trying to do is distance himself from his roots back in the more extreme Salafi jihadi circles, and essentially be a leader of a united Syria, which is something extremely difficult. And I'd love to hear your questions as to how what you think might be some of the problems or challenges going forward.
If anyone has any questions, please unmute and feel free to ask. Okay, they're a quiet group.
Yeah, it was a lot to unpack there. I kind of blazed through 200 years of history. So, but feel free to ask a question about Israel, Syria, anything that you think might be a challenge to the new government, or anything on your minds is a fair game to ask.
I'll ask a question. If you had to guess, do you think that they would actually consider negotiating with Israel in any way?
So yeah, I think
normalization or peace,
this government in Damascus, I think that it's going to take time. I mean, I'm already seeing like cultural tension with Germany and France. I think there was like some misunderstandings in the meeting that when the Germans came to meet with HTS. That to me gave me a sign that things are going to be very slow, and probably initially any channels that Israel will have will be indirect for the next probably, I don't know, few months or even a couple of years. I would say through the UAE or Saudi Arabia. Not that Israel has perfect relations with Saudi Arabia, but they probably have channels of communication. Even with Turkey, Israel, despite a breakdown in relations, Israel does have channels of communication with Turkey, which is the #1 ally right now of the Damascus government. So So Israel has back channels. In fact, I would say probably better back channels than it did, let's say, with Assad, because with Assad, you had to go through Russia. And as you know, the last couple of years, Russia has not been the best friend of Israel or the West. So that relationship soured. And anyway, I think there's a potential in the next couple of years that we will see uh, a move for a deal. And if Trump pushes for it, then that also could be something we could see. Yeah, Elon, or
Oh, yes. Thank you, Professor Parker. That was a fantastic presentation. And thanks, Corey, for arranging. So yeah, that was going to be my question, but actually I thought of something else. So I wondered, do you think this, sort of new era, what does that do for Kurdish aspirations of independence?
good question. Yeah, I threw in the Kurdish thing at the end because I thought that would probably be one of the key issues people would want to know about. And I think, um, that is a big question because the truth is that the Kurds themselves have several different factions, and there's several different ways that they could go. And it's also difficult, even when I talk to Kurds in Syria or Kurds outside of Syria, to know exactly what the majority thinks. I think for one thing, you're not going to probably see in the near short term future, you're not going to see all the Kurds suddenly give up their weapons. I think that's something that we can probably take for granted, at least in my prediction. They're not going to like just say, "Hey, let's just give up all of our guns right away to Damascus and pretend like we're just going to not defend ourselves anymore." I don't think that's going to happen. And actually, as far as I know, Damascus isn't actually asking them to do that. But the converse of that, the flip side of that is as long as they do have their weapons, it means that they have some way to kind of defend themselves. And so the Damascus can't just show up and be like and start pushing them around and telling them what to do. So I think that the issue is whether the Kurds have any cards up their sleeves. And I will tell you one card they have up their sleeves, which is something I didn't mention directly. Today, there's still about 9,000 ISIS fighters in prison in the Kurdish, area, and about 50,000 ISIS family members who still hold, as far as we know, quite strongly to the ISIS ideology. And so that's about 60,000 total people involved who were directly involved in ISIS who are alive, but they're in prison. And the prisons are managed, well, the civilians are held technically in refugee camps, but the refugee camps are prisons because they're not allowed to leave them. And so you have these massive kind of prisons, open air prisons, if you want to call them that, managed by the Kurds. And so if the Kurds are somehow, if the rug is pulled out from under them too quickly and they fall over in a collapse or the SDF goes away or whatever, you could have the release of 60,000 ISIS people into all of Syria, which would be enough perhaps to even establish like a new major ISIS movement, which would be quite destabilizing for Syria, possibly even destabilizing for the region. And I don't want to say the world, but I guess once we saw what happened in New Orleans last week, theoretically for the world.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
All right, we only have 5 minutes left. Does anyone else have another question?
Yeah, I'll ask
Natalie?
a question.
Yeah.
Joe, thanks for your time. How do you see the instability in Syria at the moment impacting Iran? And do you think it might lead to some kind of likelihood of the regime falling in the next few years?
Good question. That's a great question. I mean, I can't predict that for sure, but I will say that there's a lot of similar language being used, like for instance, the way I mentioned the Shabiha, this kind of like informal group of thugs that were used by the regime to attack people. So Iran has a similar group called the Basij, and they're a little bit different. Obviously, it's Iranian and it's different, slightly different, but it's essentially the same idea that you have kind of like a whole underground network of thugs who are available at any moment to kind of like come out into the streets and beat up protesters. And so the existence of this kind of thing in society, it's something that's not very easy to sustain because once you're ruling through coercion and force, over time, especially when today in today's world where information is almost impossible to hide, Iranian civilians are seeing this. They're seeing the Syrian changes, and it's definitely inspiring them. We've seen major inspiration on the Iranian side. I think that one of the things probably we'd like to see in Iran, or that I would probably expect to see in Iran, is a homegrown rebellion. But the only thing is, I don't know how it would work because as far as I know, the Iranian opposition isn't armed. Um, and I don't think it's actually, by the way, just for historical context, it's extremely rare for a dictatorship to be overthrown through military force. It's actually something that's only happened maybe, a handful of times in the last 200 years, a successful military uprising against a strong armed state. Most of the changes we've seen, if you look at Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, most of the changes were democratic in the sense that it was mostly like changes in administration from within. People resigned. In some cases, like Ceausescu, they were killed, but they were replaced by new leaders from the political sphere. It wasn't a massive armed revolt. So in Iran as well, I think a more likely scenario would be to follow the regime through kind of like political processes. A less likely scenario would be an armed uprising similar to what we saw in Syria, in my opinion.
We have only 2 minutes left, but there was a question in the chat from Odebek, who thanked you, by the way. She asked her predictions on the future of Russia's role in the Middle East. We'll end with
Right.
this.
So that's a great question. I mean, Russia actually now, I just saw a headline today. They've actually had to really downgrade their entire, concept of defense, because Syria was both important for Russia as an ally and as a kind of patron or a client, I would say. Russia was the patron, they were the client, patron-client relation. But it was also a forward base for the Mediterranean. And so they would actually send troops from Russia to Syria, and then from Syria into Africa, North Africa, into Libya, and also into Central and Southern Africa, in various conflicts going on there where Russia is involved. And so that's actually been quite complicated. So far, the Russians are negotiating to maintain some kind of a naval base on the coast of Syria. But right now, it's not quite clear. I mean, the Russians have quite a lot of force still located on Syrian territory. They could fight back if they wanted to. But I think Putin prefers to negotiate some kind of a uh, medium term slash long term presence in Syria so that they can continue their operations in the Mediterranean. But as far as I know, right at the very moment, Russia's in a bit of a problem. They don't have any submarines even in the Mediterranean right now, according to a headline I saw. So they've lost a lot of their military power because of this, the success of this revolution. Oh, and by the way, sorry, one quick thing to add. The Washington Post reported that Ukrainian intelligence was helping HTS in the months leading up to the success of the attack. So if you want to look for an intelligence agency that was helping behind the scenes, apparently the Ukrainians were found a willing partner to basically screw over Russia to make it.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry we're out of time.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank everyone for watching, for being involved. We will have another event in 3 weeks on international law and what is happening now in Gaza and in Israel. Details to come. I'll send something out soon. And thank you, Joel. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I will send out the recording to everybody and some information about you as well.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye bye.